When I say full of flaws, I'm talking about our conventional approach to periodization, planning, programming. It doesn't factor in what does the athlete think and how can I change that. It doesn't screen for the athlete beliefs. It doesn't build in athlete perspectives and opinions and feedback and athlete self-direction.
That was John Kiely, and you're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast. Today's podcast is brought to you by Simply Faster. Simply Faster is an online sports technology store that curates the best of in various elements of training, such as timing systems with the Freelap timing system, training tools with things such as blood flow restriction training and the keybox, athlete monitoring devices such as velocity-based training, force plates, and the VO2 Master, and much more. I choose sponsors for this show that I use their products personally. And I have been loving using blood flow restriction training this past year. The Freelap timing system has been an absolute staple for me. I've really enjoyed using bar speed tracking and the K-Box. Those and other products in their store have been a really valuable part of not just my coaching journey, but also my journey as an athlete. They have as well an amazing blog on sports performance and are a top-notch company with great customer service. Be sure to check them out, and you can do that at simplyfaster.com. That's simply with an I, faster.com. Welcome to another episode of the podcast. Oftentimes, training is thought of only on the level of exercises, sets and reps, training progressions, biomechanics, and constraints. And these things are really important and foundational to good coaching practice, but it doesn't stop there. A complete approach to coaching involves the totality of the athlete. It involves the mind, the athlete's perception, their belief systems. How are they navigating a workout mentally and emotionally, as well as physiologically and biomechanically? To talk about that totality of coaching, we have guest John Kiely. John is a senior lecturer in performance and innovation at the University of Limerick. John has extensive athletic performance training and consultation background, and he's had stops in coaching with sports such as rugby, soccer, track, and Paralympics. John is a frequent keynote speaker, and in his own time as an athlete, he won multiple titles in kickboxing and boxing. John appeared back on the podcast years ago, all the way on episode 113, where he was speaking on the brain, variability, and coordination. On today's show, John will be covering training on the level of belief systems, on the level of placebo and nocebo effects, and the impact of how we communicate training to the mind of the athlete and ultimately to the way they adapt to that training. John will be talking about coaching practices on the level of a screen of beliefs. So often we have a movement screen preceding training, but rarely do we screen on the level or even have it in our minds. What is the athlete believing about this style of training? What's their background? How are they perceiving what's being done? What's their goal and their vision? And when we really can bring all these concepts together, the belief and perception with the mechanical stressors and that progression and the biomechanics, we really can see training in a powerful way. This was a really fun show. I absolutely love how John's mind works, how he has such a strong foot in the art and the practice and also the science of things. And the integration of that and the conversation was really helpful and enjoyable for me. So let's get to episode 329 here with John Kiely. So I'm curious, you had done a presentation on this, and I think you've talked about this on multiple podcasts, but the idea, or maybe this was the quote, is that the worth of a training program is never contained in the prescription. I love that statement. So could you get into that a little bit more on, because I think most people would think, just one last little caveat is when people start in coaching or strength and conditioning or whatever the term for that, the field is, they always think, well, what exercises, what sets, what reps? And they tend to think it's this training program. This is the best training program, and think of it on that just that minute level. Curious what your thoughts are on the totality of training. What makes good training that really goes beyond just the prescription?
Okay, and that's a really good question. And I guess I'd start my answer by saying that I was that coach who put lots and lots of time into exercise design and training prescription and getting everything, all my parameters nice and symmetrical, and if we do this, it will reduce volume. And I was a Nazi, a training prescription Nazi. And I still think it's worthwhile thinking about it deeply. But I guess over the past few years, it seems to me, from a practical perspective, looking at the great coaches of yesteryear, going back to 40s and 50s, and just seeing the commonalities in terms of they were all people who, in their own very different ways, were good communicators, inspirational. They were able to get ideas and beliefs and attitudes and perspectives out of their heads into the athletes' heads. So it was something more. And I've worked with, Olympic gold medal coaches, FIFA World Coaches of the Year, top class rugby coaches, internationally decorated, all that type of stuff. And sometimes it's very hard to find the commonality between the key coaches, between the really great coaches. And I thought, well, if I kind of hang around not long enough and think about it hard enough, I'll find the commonalities. And I think I have, I have kind of opinions now, but they weren't what I started out looking for. I thought it was all, you need to be a genius at putting programs together and stuff like that. Some great coaches have really basic programs, but they're programs that, I guess the key ingredient is the athlete buys into them. The athlete is engaged. The athlete invests. The athlete can draw a straight line from what I'm doing today and where I want to go, what my long-term career goals are, what my athletic meaning is. And if they can draw that straight line, then I think that that's much more important than how great the technique is, or, what type of specific modalities you're using and in what order, or how you're creating your blocks or your training phases. Yeah. So what I mean by that is that we're all brought up, and we're still brought up, young coaches are still educated with, well, if you want to make this adaptation, then this is what you do. And yeah, it's always nice if the athlete buys in, but they don't necessarily have to. Once they do the work, they'll get the adaptation. But that's not the case. That is not the case. And I'm saying that not because it is my opinion, but my opinion doesn't mean squat in the general run of things, but that's what the evidence is clearly saying to me, not the evidence in the sporting world, because we haven't looked at this in this depth. But if you go to medical contexts or health contexts, and you look at the kind of big data research, a common theme is that, it's really important what someone's health behaviors are. But what's also really important is what they believe, or how effective they believe their health behaviors are. And so I look at my career, and I spent the first half of it trying to make improvements by, technical or prescription, change the mechanical parameters to get gains. But now I think, well, what's way more effective is, okay, how can I communicate this better to the athlete? How can I get the athlete to kind of to see the benefits of this? How can I get the athlete more involved in the program, integrate their feedback, provide some education to the athlete so their feedback next season will be better than it is this season? How can I screen the athletes for their beliefs? How can we, at the moment, we just, training theory at least suggests we can just prescribe. If you're a sprinter and you're 22 and you're coming off this training background, this is what I'm going to prescribe. Yeah, but what does the athlete believe about that? Do they actually think that, okay, yeah, that'll work for me? Or do they have a whole load of biases and predispositions and doubts that you don't know about? Because those things influence isn't the wrong word. The way I think of it is, what's the primary stimulus? What is the thing that launches the adaptive response? And so in training theory, what we believe is what launches the adaptive response is the physical activity, the load, the volume, the intensity, et cetera, et cetera. Now, we know and we acknowledge that, well, nutritional state probably has an effect to some degree. And we think, well, the amount of stress someone is under will have an effect to some degree. But they're kind of influences that slightly adapt that initial stimulus. What I'm suggesting is that's not the case. That initial stimulus, the initial adaptive signal, is influenced directly by your kind of psycho-emotional state in relation to what you're doing, why you're doing it, a set of beliefs around that. And collectively, your thoughts, your emotions, your perceptions, and the physical activity, they are the generators of that initial adaptive signal. And that's not something that we're taught. We're taught the opposite. We're taught, okay, you can have a psychology class later on, but now we're going to talk about training and what drives adaptation.
Yeah, I think so often people want to separate things to make it easier. People want to have sets and reps in its own little box, and that's an end of itself. Exercises and biomechanics in its own little box, and that's an end of itself. And then, let's put the psychology over here. Hopefully we get to it. It'd be nice to get to that. Yeah, and I just did this podcast with Jamie Smith talking about just that. Like we try to separate, or oftentimes the social and emotional is separated, but when you bring them together, it's really substantial, the difference that you get. And one of the first thing I think that I read that got my wheels turning on that level, in the sense, and I was like you had mentioned, like, you're the program writing like nerd, the periodization nerd. I mean, that was my upbringing. That was age probably 18 to early 30s for me. And even still now, I still enjoy it. Like, one of my latest kicks is getting into like Borishiko's powerlifting templates. I don't do powerlifting training, but I'm interested in the variability. It's like a same intensity, but it's variable. It's like a little randomness and variability from week to week. That intrigues me. I feel like that fits with like laws of nature. That's maybe why it intrigues me. Anyway, sorry, not trying to get hung up on that. I'm a nerd too at that. And one of the first things that I had read, this was on a running forum. I don't even remember what I was, what the goal of my search was, but someone had written this down with track and field. They had said something to the tune of like good distance coaches. They're kind of like tacticians. The jumps coaches are the nerds. So I was a jumps coach. I mean, go figure. But they had said that good sprint coaches were masters of culture. Like, they created a fiery and exciting culture. And that got my wheels spinning. I was like, wait, I thought it was all about, having the ultimate sprint program. And I mean, you need to train intelligently. But there was other things, and I forget when I first read that. Maybe it was like, I don't know, 7 years ago. But there's other things that I saw ever since then that kept compounding themselves to the belief that there's a lot more than just the training write-up. As you were talking, I wrote this down. When I was working with swimming, I saw this. Well, swimming was interesting because coaches in swimming don't write periodization like track coaches do. They are more, maybe it's because it's like the water and it's more like of a feel. There's more feeling. There's more like tactile in the water than land. And they would tend to really live in the moment more than maybe a track coach would write like their periodization for the fall. I never saw a swim coach write their periodization for the fall. I mean, they kind of knew in their head, but in swimming, though, too, one of the interesting things I noticed, and I saw this in swimming more than track for whatever reason, they called it a senior swim. So an athlete's senior year in college, they would just, at the national meet, they would just go off. A lot of times they would just blow away their old performances. It was almost like something with swimming. They could just, their will for it being their last hurrah. And for the swimmers, it was, because a lot of them just quit swimming after that because it was so intense all the way leading up to that. But I remember literally seeing one athlete, a female athlete who had struggled with injury, like was kind of up and down, a very good athlete, but with 3 months to go before her senior year final meet, like something just flipped in her. We didn't change her programming. I don't think her water programming changed, but just some switch flipped. And she just swam lights out that last meet. I mean, it was insane. Like I think she ended up with all personal bests. And it was, you could just kind of tell or sense that meet, that final destiny was pulling her forward on all levels. And I could clearly sense it far went beyond any training because we didn't change our training. Like nothing else changed, at least my gym training, like nothing else really changed. Not that much. I mean, a little bit, but it wasn't so substantial. It's like, oh yeah, we tweaked this and that's what, no, it wasn't. Anyways, sorry, just kind of a long tired, but I started there as well. And yeah, just kind of seeing those things over time, you start to ask questions and you start to say, why did they end up doing as well as they could? And then you have to reverse engineer that with all the other factors that exist in there.
So I think that's a common observation from, I think, all coaches, that something happens unexpectedly that wasn't predicted by training form, or there had been an injury, or it's something that's not normal or that wasn't expected. And one way of thinking of this, one way of shedding some light on this, is think about placebo and nocebo effects. What are they? Well, we boil it all down, and and we associate them with deception. But it's not to do with deception, and I'll explain why. For me, all the placebo effect is, I get some signal from the world, I pick up some external cue, and that cue is telling me that, okay, the future is a little rosier than you thought. Things aren't as bad as you thought. What that allows you to do, subconsciously, is release more resources. Okay, you know what? I am not in the dangerous situation I thought I was in. I can afford to release some energy, feel a little less anxious, dedicate some energy to whatever it might be. So it really, all placebo is I'm taking in a cue from the external world. I'm interpreting that to mean the future is a little brighter. That then allows me to release resources to whatever it is. And releasing resources can be thinking. Thinking demands energy, demands cerebral blood flow. That's something that we limit in if we are stressed, for example, or in context of threat. You're either going to divert an awful lot of energy to worrying about something, but it won't be going to something positive, something productive. So if you think of placebo and nocebo then is obviously the opposite of placebo, evil twin type thing, except it's not. Nocebo is more sensitive, and when it's activated, it's more powerful than placebo. And I think that's very informative for coaches, because it kind of all of a sudden puts an emphasis, a direct physiological link. If I want this person to adapt from this training session, I need to get my messaging right about this training session. If I get my messaging wrong, they can keep doing those reps until they're blue in the face, but they're not going to get any positive adaptation from it. Why? Well, if I'm picking up negative signals, which could well be from the coach, and there is some initial research on this where even a coach's facial expression, if interpreted as negative, has negative effects on it. So from the kind of the perspective I'm getting at it here, what the athlete thinks, the signals, the cues that they pick up, that they're surrounded by in any environment. Within the training environment, those cues, I won't say need to be carefully managed, but they need to be, you need to be conscious. Brett Bartholomew, if you know him, I think one of his books was Conscious Coaching. Conscious is a really good word. If I'm coaching, I need to be really conscious that if I give negative signals, that's going to negatively affect this athlete and their ability to adapt to this training. As a coach, sometimes you need to give bad news, but there's also awareness around how that's framed. Simple study in the medical literature, if I say, well, here's a medication, 10% of people get side effects, versus I say, here's a medication, 90% of people don't get side effects. You are telling the truth. You are being honest in both options. But in one option, in the negatively framed one, people get more side effects than in the positively framed one. No other difference other than 10% get negative effects, 90% don't get negative effects. So there are small little tweaks that, again, if we're conscious, if we're coaching in that conscious manner, we can manage our communication. And coaching communication for me is a training variable. Your presence as a coach is a training variable, the same as the weight on the bar or the number of reps or the time of the lap, whatever it is a training variable. It's a training variable because it substantially regulates the resources that are released by brain and body to adapt to the training stimulus.
I wanted to take a break from the show and briefly share with you the difference that performance herbalism can make for you. Several years ago, I had Logan Christopher, CEO of Lost Empire Herbs, on the show to talk about hypnosis and mental training for athletes. While talking to him, I realized he also had an herbalism company. So shortly thereafter, I used the Phoenix formula, which was my first product I bought from them. I had great results with it, not only increasing my energy and decreasing my need for coffee and caffeine, but I also noticed that it was making an impact on my lifts and my weight room numbers. I was having a great training experience. Shortly thereafter, I also got into the Shilajit resin as well as other herbs. And I don't look at supplementation the same way. I'm a strong believer in what Logan and his company are doing in looking for a natural resource to boost human performance. If you want to check out the herbs that I use personally from Lost Empire Herbs, you can head to www.lostempireherbs.com/justfly. There you can get 15% off your order, and they offer a 365-day money-back guarantee. Definitely check them out. Let's get on back to the show. Yeah, I mentioned that it was maybe like 6 or 7 or whatever I said years ago that I read that the little piece about the different track coaches. But the longer I've gone and the more I think about the placebo effect, the more I think about like even my own training history as well as athletes I've worked with. But it's easiest, the N of one, in your own experience is always an easy place to go. And there was a year where I may have talked about this on the podcast, but when I was 21, so almost 20 years ago now, 18 years ago, I had just an absolute breakout track and field. I mean, it was so much better this track season than the previous years. I high jumped about 10 centimeters higher, triple jumped over a meter farther. It was my speed was the best it had ever been. I mean, I was so athletic compared to all my past years, which one of the past years, amongst other things, mistakes that I made, overthinking and trying to guide too much of my own training was one element. I had an assistant coach who was like the master of psychology. Looking back, this guy was the master. And I didn't really understand it at the time. I just liked him, talking to him about training and stuff. But he would talk to me about, like, he was in contact with a Russian high jump coach. The Russians having a lot of the best high jumpers in the world typically. And this high jump coach had jumped like 7'6" or 2 meters 30 back in the day and was still jumping well. And he would always tell me, Igor told me about this exercise that he did. And so of course I'm like, oh yeah, this is amazing. And I do it. And they were of course good exercises too, but there was also that mystique of there's this training group does it and this is going to be the best thing. And that coach as well would give you a placebo effect that you even knew, like you knew he was doing it, but it didn't matter. He would always, if you jumped, were long jumping and you jumped, like you had a foul and it was like 21 feet or something, he would just get all excited and say, oh, that was 23 feet. And he would fully embody like as if you jumped that. And we all knew he was like exaggerating, but it kind of didn't matter because the energy that gave you wanted to let yourself kind of be tricked that you actually had more in you. And it was just like little things like that. Even the bar that year when I would jump in the fall, the bar was like an inch lower, or it was an inch lower than I thought it was. The whole fall, I thought it was jumping an inch or maybe 2 inches higher than I actually was. So I believed I was actually better than I was. And there was just so much psychological stuff that year that I didn't take into account. And then I will see that in, the placebo effect, but swimming, it was a cool one to go through this, is I would see swim coaches, one in particular who the taper at the end of the year. So it's like the month before their biggest meet, he had this huge taper checklist. It was like a page or maybe 2 pages long of all the things you weren't supposed to do. Like, don't walk up the stairs, or it's just like, it would just get crazy, like silly. But that team tapered really, really well. And I think it was because there was it was almost like the sillier it was sometimes, the more like psychological power that had. Like you believed 100% in that taper process. And, whether the little suggestions did anything or they didn't, it didn't matter because it kind of set that off in your psychology. The question I want to ask you with that, because you mentioned ethically, And I guess we could think about that like medically, like the placebo effect is powerful. But like to me, it's always like, well, the long-term effect. Like if I am giving athletes like this taper checklist or telling them these things and it's not necessarily true, I mean, maybe what's like the level of optimism, I guess, is what I'm trying to ask. Like, because when people find out it's not a placebo or it was a placebo, like I know in the medical world, there was a good study there's like the Kerboisin study from the 60s. Some guy believed that he was getting this ultimate treatment. His like cancer tumor shrunk when he was getting this. And then that kind of went on for a bit. But then when he found out it was a sham treatment, then he ended up dying because then, his belief was shattered. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is, or ask is, what's your take on, like you said, ethically, using that placebo effect or being an optimist in a way is going to help the athlete reach their best potential?
Okay, so I guess just to backtrack a little, when I was talking about the placebo effect, what I was really getting at was the power of suggestion and belief and positive reframing of current situation. So, for example, if we take placebo, I would definitely not mislead an athlete at all, because it's a very short-term strategy. Mm-hmm. And as soon as the athlete finds out, well, I can't really trust this guy, or they're telling me a lie, or they're telling me a lie now, maybe they're just saying it to cheer me up or to make me feel better. So I that's not what I'm talking about. And the second thing I'd say there is deception isn't necessary. So, for example, there's a studied phenomenon called the honest placebo. First major study, 2008, guy called Ted Kapchuk in Harvard. You bring people in that were all chronic irritable bowel sufferers. So, haven't had it myself, but seemingly it's extremely painful, when it's serious. So these are people that have been around all the docs, and they've tried all the treatments. And this is last gasp saloon. I'm signing up for a study. They go into the medic's office, and the medic said, I'm prescribing you these tablets or these pills. They are sugar pills. There is no medicinal value. But placebos have been shown to reduce pain in all of these studies. And pain is the most researched aspect of placebo. And it's, in many tests, placebos have outperformed opioids. So we're not talking about kind of small little effects. These are big effects. So those people who got the honest placebos enhanced pain outcome. So what that says to me is, and this has been investigated a ton of times since, it's like, it's not about deception. It is about, I guess, positively framed messages. And let me see, what I'm trying to think of what would be an example. As coaches, we need to give critical feedback, but we can also always positively frame that feedback. That's one dimension of it. Another dimension of it is showing the athlete that we respect them and their goals, their long-term goals, where they want to get, and everything we do for them, even though we might be serving the initial needs of a club or a team or a university, we're also doing our best to service their long-term needs. So when they look at us and they come into one of our programs, they can say, okay, this person has my back. This person is going to be honest with me. I can trust this person. They will not deceive me. This person communicates well with me. They obviously pay attention to what I think and care and believe. It's putting all of those things in place that this hasn't been studied directly in our world, but if you take the strong evidence, overwhelming evidence from other worlds, specifically medical, you can see that, well, actually, they'll all stack up. They will add up and they will make your program, your athlete outcomes more robust, for sure. There's a useful concept around this. And again, it's one of these words, kind of like stress, it means a little bit of everything and it's not well defined. But the concept of mindset. Now, from a scientific perspective, mindset it's not one thing. You don't have a mindset for your life. But what you do have is you might have a mindset around strength training, or a mindset around high intensity sessions, or a mindset around injury risk. So a mindset really is the set of beliefs, the set of expectations and associations you make in terms of a specific phenomenon or specific sub-phenomenon of your life. So, for example, it's how I feel about high-intensity training. It's a set of beliefs there. But those beliefs will, if you like, set the neurobiological backdrop. I'm looking out through my eyes. I'm interpreting this session. I hate this session. I'm anxious before it. Energy is diverted into all types of protective mechanisms or to power protective mechanisms. It is not allocated to, no, this is a good session. This is going to help you. I feel confident. I feel competent. I feel safe doing this session. If I'm in that situation, then all these adaptive resources are released. And it's not just energy, it's complex molecules that go into driving neural change. If you're learning a new coordinative skill, it's everything. It drives your perceptions, your cognitions, your emotions, your biological backdrop. And the neurochemical and biological backdrop that we overlay the actual physical training on, that's the fertile ground, or it's the barren ground. And it's ground that we as coaches can help prepare and make more nourishing, or make more nutrient scarce, if you like. Struggling for words, but you get the picture.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. I have a couple follow-ups off that. The first one, actually, I'll go to something you had said with the brain. The brain is an energy, like the brain takes like 20% or something of our glucose or something like that. You had mentioned that.
So it's 2% of body weight, 20% of energy demand.
Yeah.
Under normal conditions.
Yeah, and with so much, like an athlete who overthinks. So if that, I just think a lot about training. I would just call like training in the present moment. This maybe doesn't, the second question had more to do with the placebo effect, but I just wanted to cover this before I asked you more on that how do we establish that belief system? I guess what I'm trying to say is athletes who overthink the process and that draining you of energy or possibly even adaptive resources. I think about it in the sense of what we call like in like basketball. I played basketball and did track, and in a basketball game, I mean, we didn't have GPS when I was playing, but I would estimate I did dozens, if not well over 100 short accelerations hard in the course of a basketball game. Varying distances and dozens of jumps of varying intensities, and sustained like aerobic and not really lactate, but maybe a couple sprints, maybe slightly getting in there. Anyways, if you made a training program of all that work and called it training and assigned mental willpower to each movement you did, I feel like that would be an exhausting workout relative to just playing basketball. I mean, of course, you're feeling it after you play or whatever your sport is. But when we actually make it training and we assign thought to it, I guess one of my question is your thoughts on the present moment in training. When and how athletes should intellectually participate. Because I do think athletes should be intellectually bought in. I guess my question is your thoughts on the level of what type of intellectual participation you feel like is ideal for athletes in the course of training.
Okay, that's a good question. Interesting, you didn't mention D cells in your basketball when you were running.
Oh, yeah. Of course, yeah, eccentric too, yeah. Okay, that's
okay. Just checking back. So one way to think about that is we have all these ways, and you've alluded to this already, how we kind of parcel up different things and put them in silos. So one of these concepts would be energy. So there's cognitive load, there might be psycho-emotional load, there's physiological load. But all of those feed into the same, let's call it stress response. That can manifest as a stress. What is stress? Well, stress is something that demands energy. I think of stress as uncertainty. Now, I'm saying uncertainty because that's the word that the people who specialize in this field, that's what they use now. they don't think of stress the way we think of stress in the sports world. Conventionally, and if you read any periodization piece ever, they'll talk about Hans Selye in the 1930s and the general adaptation syndrome. And that really was where this great scientist, Hans Selye, did a lot of experiments with rodents. He made them very hot, he made them very cold, he starved them, did a lot of nasty things to rodents, and came up with this idea that there was a predictable general way that living beings adapted to stress. And this is actually where the kind of myth of I can predict training outcomes is rooted in. That's what it is, and that's what all periodization theorists hark back to and say, well, we can essentially, not in these words, but saying we can predict because the general adaptation syndrome has a predictable trajectory. Now, I'm after saying quite a lot there, but the important bit here is that we're assuming, or we have culturally made an assumption that you can predict training outcomes. And the evidence is completely against that. You can maybe predict the average of 20 people, but you can't predict training outcomes. Now, I realize I'm after sliding off your question, but I'm kind of plowing on here while I'm on this train of thought. So it kind of feels to me like we have this kind of disconnect in our training theory. We have this sense that if you survey coaches, and I'm saying this because I've recently done this with a doctoral candidate I work with, German Sports Institute, Kechi and Adika Danes, and we asked coaches what they thought. Did they think that, for example, buy-in was important, or that athletes' emotional investment was important, or if how the athlete understood the program was important? And they all scored those things really highly as the physical training that the athlete did. And that kind of knocked me for six, because I would never have guessed that. And if you read the training theory, what's in the literature, you would never have guessed that, because that's not reflected in the literature at all. The sports science literature is all about do this to get this. It's a very predictive model. And I guess where I come in with the general adaptation syndrome is that's what it harks back to. This thing that was formulated in 1936 that suggests that there's a predictable trajectory, and we can therefore predict training stress and the adaptive response for training stress. The rug has been completely pulled out of that, 60 years ago in other worlds, but we're still educating young coaches that way. We're still being asked to present training programs that way, as in it's numbers. It's an empirical training prescription. It's the Excel sheet. And I guess the quote that you mentioned at the start, that the value of it, or the worth of a training program, is never kind of baked into its prescription. No, it's not. It's baked into how does the athlete interpret this? Do they understand it? Do they believe in it? Can they draw that line between what the coach says and where I want to go, what I want my athletic career to be about, my purpose, my athletic purpose? And the more we make those links explicit to the athlete, the more we convince the athlete in an honest way, in an ethical way, that I think this would be the best way for you. Then I think we're not just doing the right thing, but we're actually doing something that is fundamentally baked into their training response. If they do not have faith in you, they will not respond appropriately or optimally. If they are nervous, they will not respond. If they're anxious, if any of those things, they will not adapt, because resources, which are tightly regulated, our body or brain doesn't have access to limitless resources. And we're kind of evolutionarily programmed to be very sparing of them. So these things don't get regulated willy-nilly. It's not just a case of have a high carb drink or a protein shake and you're good to go. No, that's not it at all. If you're highly stressed, those calories will be conserved. So in relation to the relevance of the athlete's attention, I think that's fundamentally important. it's what they're paying attention to and how they're interpreting those signals. So if I'm paying attention to that pain in my knee from that old ACL I had years ago, you could think of that's like an active nocebo type effect. I'm focusing on, and then if the thoughts that I'm generating as a result of that attention is, oh, there's a little ping again, that's a recipe for, okay, just by doing that, I'm altering what's happening in my brain. I'm altering the signals to my body. I'm altering how I move. Okay, so now I'm after messing with the kind of the what's going on at a muscular level and what tissues are being stressed. And it's been made more suboptimal. Now I'm setting myself up for, now I'm going to develop another hotspot. Then I'm going to adapt some more. Then I'm going to get injured because sooner or later I'm going to be asked to execute a movement that I am just not set up to do because I've limited my safe options for executing that movement because I've worried too much about it, in a sense. Now, and this is something that would be a very strong message coming out with the pain research, and that would be that if you want something to hurt more, think about it more, pay more attention to it. If you want something to be less disruptive to you, you need to think about, you need to have a coping mechanism, a self-talk mechanism that can divert your attention and your negative association with what is often a very small signal, what we might think of as a small pain signal, that we wrap all these interpretations and worries and anxieties around. And then by the time it hits your higher brain, it's just been amplified through the roof. And you keep doing that, and that gets worse and worse, and it becomes what's the right word? It becomes a chronic problem. And you see that again in pain. Often people are getting pain when the source of pain is actually can't be found anymore. But now it's been wired into a neural loop that's just kind of self-perpetuating. And what's doing it? Well, it's our focus on that initial small signal and then our overreaction to that initial small signal.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've heard coaches talk about this, and I've seen it. You have the athlete who maybe they walk in the gym and they're like, they might be saying something, oh, my knee's a little sore or something. And then you roll a ball out and start with a game instead of typical training. If this is the weight room, of course, it could be, but even this could be in a sport practice too. Roll a ball out, kids start playing, and that knee just gets forgotten instantly. Oftentimes, depends on who it is. But as soon as the attention goes somewhere else, it's like, oh. And I was just, sometimes I think I have my my training insights. The place that they hit me more than anything, sometimes I like to go run in the woods. Like trail run, kind of, but more like do sprints or run in the creek and things like that. And just because it's very variable and all sorts of different obstacles and elements. And I was just thinking, I had this thought the other day that, what is driving my adaptation here? Is it the sum of all the mechanical stresses on my body, on my legs as they interact with the ground? Or is it how my body perceives what is happening to me, the training, and then my goal, my vision, my direction, my why? And I get the overwhelming feeling that, yes, the mechanical stress is absolutely important. I think that's important on some key level. That's definitely an important element. But if you don't have, and going through the process of watching athletes as long as I have, you see that if you have an exceptionally high why and vision, and then you're perceiving the workouts well, that is that recipe for a success. As soon as you lose a chink in that triad, your vision isn't that, maybe you don't have that much of a vision for yourself. Maybe you perceive oh, well, I really wish I was doing this workout, or maybe your threat levels are going off with a particular workout. Or you could say the sets and reps aren't correct with the mechanical stresses or exercise biomechanics as well. But I think if something's off in one of those three things, you're going to get diminished results. But yet we so often only think of it from the level of the mechanics and not those other two. So I was going to say something too about the perception, which I'm kind of getting lost because there's so many concepts flying around here. But even, I know you have young children, and one thing and you talked about threat, and stress as it perceives to training. And one thing I've always noticed watching my kids play, and they'll see me exercising too, so they'll try to do some of the things I do. I never like tell them to, they're like 4 and 6. I'm not going to tell them to exercise, but they'll see me like hanging from a tree branch, like just for time or something. And my daughter will ask to do it. And she wants to see how long, she can go. I don't know if it's because she really wants to or because she thinks dad wants her to or something. Hopefully not. But she'll do that. And you never see like a look of strain on her face when she's doing like hanging from a tree branch. Or if she'll see me do a handstand, or she'll go up and do a handstand. And she never looks like she's tired. And children never really look like kind of the emotions, like the negative stress and strain that shows up on adults' faces. I remember recently, the last time I was working in a high school track situation about 2 years ago, coming in to coach like jumps and hurdles, these kids, like they would high jump and you just see like these pained expressions on their face of like, all the adult emotions that they've gained over the years. Whereas kids like don't have that, like, I don't know if you call it like a stress or trauma response to exercise, but they don't have it. They're just experiencing it for what it is. And I'm like, we need more of this. If I can help athletes, guide athletes into that. And I think that's where Tommy John, who's been on this podcast, and a lot of people have drawn inspiration from this, train like a child. I think that's what he means when he says that, is you're not, you're if you watch a child, they don't have the negative stress psychologically to what we would call exercise that adults do. So anyways, I kind of started with that triad that I made up in my head and then went off on the train like a child thing. But I just, as you were talking, it's been fun to formulate that as you go along.
Just to jump in that, because it is a good example. I mean, I guess it works both ways. It's just that they don't have those conditioned beliefs embedded in their brains.
Yeah.
So your daughter can hang and is very open to, they're not jumping up, grabbing the branch and thinking, this is going to hurt.
Yeah. Yep.
Or, a kid stubs their toe and you kiss it and all of a sudden it's better. It's perception. And I guess the most important thing I think from it, to take from this, or at least the most important for me from an understanding point of view, is to look at how does performance enhancement actually happen? How do we get better? Now, again, the old model is a very reactive model. If you do this, you get this. Okay, if you do this physical exercise, you get this physical outcome. And that's what's embedded in sports science, training theory. That's what you get if you do, NSCA, whatever it might be, UKSA over this side, that's what you get. Do this, get this. Now, that's not actually the way stress works in the real world. So it's like training stress happens, that activates a stress response. The reality is, it is not the physical act that activates the stress response. The stress response is activated by your perception of what's going to happen and how your body needs to prepare for that. So if you think of it, it makes no sense for evolution to have given us a reactive system. So, okay, first this happens, this is the stimulus, and then you react. That's way too slow. That's not how things go. It's like saying, if you were to do 100 meters, don't do a warm-up. You're going to be doing 100 meters. It has to be good performance. So you get prepared. Kind of the exact same for your body. So your brain is always making predictions. This is what's going to happen. And as kids, we're not great at it because we don't have experience, but then we build up these, and some of them are biases and predispositions, but we make predictions. Now, there's a kind of a take-home for this from a coaching and training management perspective. And that is, and I hope I've explained that clearly enough, but just to reiterate, in case it sounds very, kind of airy-fairy, waving my hands in the air, the old perception was, first you got to stress, and that stress perturbed homeostasis, and then homeostasis restored, and it restored by going through a number of predictable steps. Fast forward 80 years, and the science says, no, there is no general adaptation. And if you wait until you have a stress before you react, that's way too late. That's too late, except in extremes. If something happens out of the blue, then you will have a reactive response. But that's pretty much just to save your life. It's things like pH level in the brain and blood circulation in the brain and things like this. They're homeostatic processes. Other processes are what's termed allostatic processes. That's what most people would term them now. Allostatic processes are regulated by prediction. So I'm going to train. What are my set of thoughts, beliefs, assumptions wrapped around this training session and the relevance of this training session to me, to my purpose, my objectives? If it's not clear, then resources are not going to get allocated that freely. I won't have an optimal adaptive response. And again, it goes to the metabolic and mechanical stimuli are overlaid on arable ground, on fertile ground, or on barren ground, dependent on where our neurochemistry is, where our biochem is. And that's regulated by our perceptions, our state of, am I anxious? Am I not anxious? Am I stressed? Am I not stressed? Am I fearful? Am I not fearful? That's what regulates that. If we're in a place where we know we're going to be challenged, but we feel confident, we feel competent, we know the coach has our back, we know we're in a good training group and we've all worked diligently. If you're in that place, then you might feel nervous, but you feel ready and you feel confident in your own ability. And that's the perfect place to be. If not, if you and the coach had an argument, if things haven't gone well, if you're paying too much attention to that pain in your knee, then you're in a very, very different place. And both of those places aren't discussed within our kind of training theory. It's all sets, reps, intensities, technique. Those things are important, but they're not the only thing.
Yeah. As you're talking about that too, like with the gas and how kind of like that lying more along the lines of linear thinking versus complex thinking, more modern approach to it. I've thought about, and I've had this discussion with elite level coaches where, like, if gas was the way to go, the general adaptation syndrome, and this A plus B equals C, like the human is a machine, then you should be able to do, like, if a training program worked for you really well 4 years ago, you should be able to do that exact same training program 4 years later and get the same result. But it doesn't work that way. It never works that way. And I think a lot of times people expect that. I've seen this happen where athletes or individuals, they aren't doing very well in training, and they might say, oh, well, I used to do this and it works so well, blah, blah, blah. And yes, maybe there's elements of that for sure that fit with your physiology. I'm not saying that that's wrong at all, but at the same time, I like the quote that a man never crosses the same river twice because he's not the same man and it's not the same river. But we're also not thinking about the social and emotional factors in someone's life. We're not also looking at the fact that if you repeat a program, you lose novelty now. It's not like exciting to you the same way it was the first time as well. Like you've been talking to with attention. And I think that's an example or an anecdote that, as you're talking, I feel like fits with what you're saying, is that because if it was purely gas, we could just repeat those programs and it would be just fine. But that's why we need to come up with new ones. They fit the same principles, but things are different. We still are driving attention and novelty and paying attention to social and emotional elements.
Absolutely, I think that's a really good point to bring out. And myself and Craig Pickering, I don't know if you remember, ex-international sprinter, Olympic sprinter. So we did a paper published in Sports Med, and Craig was interested in genetics and genetic differences. And we reviewed the available genetic evidence, and we could, show that you can respond to a training program now. Like, I will respond differently to a training program than you. You will respond differently to you a year ago. And that how your experience now and your experience then differs, we don't know. So there's a big kind of missing chunk. How we interpret how we're likely to respond to training it's guesswork. And even if, and I used to think previously that, well, if someone responded well before, they're more than likely to do again. But no, that kind of non-responder, high responder dynamic can flip. So it makes it really hard. Now, a lot of the time, what I think we're something like periodization, which is a pretty kind of simplistic model, that's great if you don't know what to do, because we all hate uncertainty. So if you don't know what to do, it gives you a sense of, okay, this is something concrete I can do. And I think that's fine. But if you're looking to push your practice, if you're looking to be, to move more down the optimal level of the scale, then we need to be thinking through these problems. That's like a training program that's just facts and figures and numbers. That's not a training program. That's just, well, here's what I'm forecasting, even in the knowledge that you can't actually forecast what the best training is. So I think of training rather than a prescription. It's, okay, how do I design the process? Where the process is, how do I collect information? Where information is also athlete beliefs, perspectives, opinions. And then how can we make those processes automatic? So if you like, at the back end of the process, you're actually spitting out what you're going to do next in training. So it's kind of just that shift from, it's the coach in the darkened room creating a work of genius that tells you what you're going to do for the next couple of months. It's me and the coach, or the coach group, or whatever it is. Okay, we need to evolve a set of processes that inform what we do. Now, sometimes that's not feasible because you've limited time. Maybe you have a big squad. Maybe you're working with, in the university context in the US, for example, you could be working with a lot of athletes across different squads. And then you just have to be pragmatic. You can't be, looking for the optimal program. It's what's the most pragmatic program. But I don't really see an example where the best pragmatic program is, I'm just going to go and do something that I know is so full of flaws that it's not correct. And when I say full of flaws, I'm talking about our conventional approach to program, periodization, planning, programming. It doesn't factor in what does the athlete think and how can I change that. It doesn't screen for the athlete beliefs. It doesn't build in athlete perspectives and opinions and feedback and athlete self-direction. And maybe the last piece is just a little more on the education. If we get an athlete at 18, we shouldn't be having the same conversations with them as we are when they're 25 or they're 30 or they're 35. We have to take responsibility for helping them evolve their thought processes, their background education. So when you get an athlete at 18, your prescription might look like in one thing. But when you're working with them and they're a 34-year-old elite athlete going to their last Olympics, then it needs to be something different. They need to have been educated and have the kind of self-awareness to give meaningful feedback or be the designer of the program, and the coach is just a sounding board. But again, it's just something we often see that, well, planning is the same when you're this age, just when you have 10 years more experience. And it shouldn't be. But to facilitate that, we just need to educate as athletes go through their career.
Yeah, kind of to wrap this up, John, the last question, maybe just kind of this will be a little bit of a nutshell type question, but you've mentioned the scream for beliefs idea, which I had written that down and highlighted it and put an exclamation point behind it. I love that idea because so often it's like, well, here's this movement screen for injuries, like we're going to predict injury through a movement screen, but no one talks about like a belief screen. And so I'm curious you've mentioned it a little bit already or alluded to those ideas in coaching, but I'm curious what might be included in that screen or what some elements might look like there. And then I also, if we have time, I'd be curious too on just kind of a checklist for the non-responder. And maybe that fits hand in hand with the belief screen. So thoughts on the belief screen and maybe a checklist of sorts for someone who's a non-responder with a training program.
Perfect. Well, I'd love to take ownership of the screen idea, but it's something I picked up from the medical world and the medical research, where they were looking at how they can make medications more effective. And one of the key ways was, well, I need to find out what the patient believes will help them. And then I match my medication to their beliefs. And that's not something, as you know, that's conventional in a medical context, but they found it very effective. So Yeah, so it's from there I got that. It's like, yeah, well, if I'm prescribing this exercise for this person, I need to either explain to them why they need to buy that argument, or I need to find out what the block is, like why they don't believe in it, and I need to change it. Because for me, giving an athlete an exercise they don't believe in is just, it's fundamentally self-limiting, not a waste of energy, and a waste of athlete trust and faith. So that's the kind of screening for beliefs. In relation to non-responder, yeah, maybe I shouldn't use non-responder. I don't really think there's non-responder. There's low responders. There's low response, high response. Now, I think that if you were identifying somebody within a squad that was a low responder to training, I think there's a number of things that I would do. First thing, I would check their beliefs and then look at either changing those or adapting the session in a way where you were getting the same result or you were moving towards the same result as you want to get from a kind of general performance perspective, but you were also taking into account their concerns and you were navigating around those concerns in some way. Like if it was a high intensity, agility type session, maybe you find out that, I had this previous knee injury and that session always fires it up. You go, okay, no problem. Let's break it down. Let's take out those turns, or let's reduce the number of turns on that side and just see if you get pain after this, and then let's grow it. Or you can always do something to say to the athlete, to signal to the athlete, I am taking your perspective into account. I agree with you. It's important. Here's what I'm doing to manipulate the training variables to get you the same effect, but by reducing your concern. Something like that, for example. So low responder, high responder, there's all kinds of things you can change. Change beliefs. Are they stressed? Are they not stressed? Can I change the delivery? So if it's, if it's a strength training session, change exercise, change sets and reps. Or, you know what, let's do a much shorter session, but we'll make it a little bit more intense. And I guess this is going from a basic place in my head where I'm thinking, there's no way I can predict what will work for this person. So how can I quickly kind of rotate through a number of sensible, viable options that they buy into to try and find the right fit? Then when we find the right fit, then we can keep that team and manipulate that team as time goes on. Did that make a degree of sense?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I believe that coaching, like you had said, like the idea of this coach is this, the coach goes into the dark room and comes up with the ultimate training program, and but it's much more of a facilitation or a partnership with the athlete, understanding what they perceive as great training. What do they love doing? What training are they not thinking about? Oh, is this going to work? And great coaches I've experienced training alongside, they do that. They take the athlete's opinion into account seriously, and it is that partnership where they understand that with the athlete and what they want, what they enjoy doing. And I've seen that play out in different ways. I think it's always individual to the coach a little bit, how exactly it plays out. But that always is just, to me, that seems a lot more successful trend-wise than this thought of, oh yeah, it's just the magician in the dark room coming up with the ultimate program. And yeah, I think I think sometimes good programming too, has that feeling to it. There's a self-directedness to that. So I know even in my own, when I'm intake clients, I always, on my intake sheet, I'd ask them, well, what training do you like doing? What's worked well for you in the past? What's your favorite workout? That's been on there. And that's always something that's important for me to understand. And yeah, I think that's just such a good, it's a good way to close out the show. Definitely so many things to think about. It makes good sense, John. So thank you so much for your time. I know we didn't get through all the questions, probably 3 of them, but those are the best shows, where just we can really take a deep dive into some of these things. So I appreciate your time, and definitely gave me a lot of things to think about and compile with my own thought process.
Well, look, Joel, I really enjoy this, the same as our first contact. I'm sorry, I know I rambled on, but I guess like you, I feel kind of passionately and strongly, and I've spent a professional life trying to develop and understand these things better. So, yeah, I mean, if any of your listeners have any feedback or anything like that, I'll give you a link and people can hit me back.
Thank you for tuning in to another show. If you're interested in contacting John, if you go to the Just Fly Sports podcast main page, scroll down, we'll have some links you can contact, give John feedback or ask him questions within his bio there. And just thank you again for listening. Really appreciate it. If you want to help us out, you can leave us a rating or review on whatever platform you're listening to this podcast on. We'll see you guys next week.